Hello, HeartMind Alchemy Lab community. I am very, very excited tonight to have Dr. Jeff Tarrant here with us. Welcome, Dr. Tarrant.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time. This is HeartMind Happy Hour. I am your host tonight, Holly Copeland, and very, very excited to bring Dr. Tarrant's work to this community to discuss neuromeditation, and we'll also touch on some of my favorite topics and some topics that I know are of great interest to this community. So talking about brainwave entrainment devices and technology, using them for common challenges that people have: stress, anxiety, ADHD, trauma, things like that. But also talking about non-ordinary states of consciousness, altered consciousness, and technology around that. And Dr. Tarrant has a ton of experience in that area and has spent a lot of time in that field, and specifically developed a Neuromeditation Institute around that. Has an extensive background in spiritual and meditative practices, including Zen, Vipassana, Qigong, mindfulness-based practices. So he's really, and then started the Neuromeditation Institute. So I think he's a wonderful person to have to speak to that. So thanks so much for being here to enlighten us all.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about that, but it'll be fun.
Yeah, I use that word in the lightest.
Right.
form.
Yeah. Small e enlightenment.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I mean, you know what? If the big E happens, I'll be, thrilled.
That'd be great.
They say it can happen anytime, so
right.
I'm all for it. Well, I think a wonderful place to start would just be to talk to us a little bit about the Neuromeditation Institute, your background, and how you got started in this field. What led you to it?
Mm-hmm. So my background is as a psychologist. That's what my degree's in, is in counseling psychology. And so I had no intention of getting into what I'm doing right now. When I was in school, I thought I would be talking to adolescents about their problems. And I did that for a short time. I always had a lot of interest in spirituality and Eastern religions in particular. And, but really didn't have a way to kind of work with that. I went to school and grew up in mid-Missouri, and, mid-Missouri in the 80s and 90s, there was not much available in that regard. And so, anyway, over time, what happened was found some ways to get involved with meditative practices. Zen was really where I got started, and spent several years sitting with a Rinzai monk who happened to be in my town. He was hiding, and I found him in the middle of Missouri. Anyway, and then went on to, experience and experiment with a variety of other practices. At the same time, my work as a psychologist shifted from more traditional talk therapy to physiological monitoring and biofeedback, neurofeedback. And so really, I've been doing that as a primary clinical tool for 20-something years. And so then, there's everybody in this group will understand, right? There's an obvious connection, and it doesn't take long to figure out, like, well, wait a minute. I've got all these tools that I can use to alter my state, and all these other techniques, these ancient techniques to alter my state, they have to go together. And, in the early days, I played around with what we knew, which was primitive by our current standards. And so I did that for a while and really didn't get much out of it. It was kind of like, okay. And it really wasn't until about 7 years ago that I had an opportunity to kind of dust some of that off and revisit some of that. And what ended up happening was really getting into all of the scientific literature that I hadn't really paid a lot of attention to. I'd paid a little bit. But really took a deep dive into it and saw just how much we know about meditation now from a brain perspective. And And that really sent me down a path of really integrating. It was like, oh, that's why I've done all these things in my life, right? It was like, I get it. It enabled me to take all these different things that I'd done and experienced and kind of pull it together in a way to really understand meditation in a different way, in kind of a brain-based way that can then, be used to help people identify which practices are going to be the best match for what they're trying to achieve. And because of my background as a psychologist, that's where most of my attention has been, is thinking from a psychological perspective. Why are people meditating? If you're meditating because you want to get rid of pain or not be depressed, then it's like, there are specific ways to engage in meditation that are likely to be more useful based on how they impact the brain. So we've kind of developed an entire, it started off as just something kind of for fun, and now it's become my full-time job, and we've got an institute and staff and all kinds of things. And so we're really developing a variety of approaches to kind of help people kind of understand our orientation, but then also develop specific tools to facilitate the ability to sort of find those states and learn to cultivate them, in a more deep way.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. And I should say, for folks listening, so I took your Neuromeditation Institute course, which I really loved, and in particular found that the way that you laid everything out, because I had, as somebody who was also interested in this area and a meditator, kind of done my own kind of following papers and looking at things, but the way that you brought it together in the book that you wrote, Meditation Interventions to Rewire the Brain, was so clear and easy to follow. And for me, it just kind of brought it all together in a wonderful framework and a really wonderful cohesive way. So really valuable contribution. So thank you for that.
Oh, well, thank you. Thanks for the kind words.
It really was. And just so folks know, so I sort of since then I went ahead and I'm on the path to certify as a Neuromeditation Institute coach, which yay, I'm real excited about, to put that in my little quiver of coaching tools, because this is the topic that I'm really passionate about coaching people around, and you've given this wonderful framework for doing that. So maybe it would be helpful. There's 4 key styles to the neuromeditation approach, and different areas of the brain are basically influenced or better assisted through these different styles. Maybe it's helpful for you to just kind of give a little primer, lay out the ground for anybody who doesn't know, and then we can launch into the juicier topics on
totally
devices and consciousness that follow.
Yeah. The stuff people really want to talk about.
Yeah.
So we generically kind of have 4 styles that we mostly focus on, and I'll kind of describe those in a second. We have a 5th style that we also teach and talk about, but it's the mysterious deep state style, which is a little bit wigglier in terms of trying to teach and talk about. So we tend to focus on the first 4, which are we call focus, mindfulness, open heart, and quiet mind. And these are styles that we identified from all the research literature. It's not hard to look into the research and see that there's these names that people are using consistently to describe meditations. They'll use terms like open monitoring or focused attention, loving kindness, compassion. You'll see these kinds of things frequently in the research, but then they'll use other things like effortless awareness and things like this. And so really what we did was kind of look at all of that and say, well, wait a minute, some of these are the same thing. They're using different terms to basically describe the same state. So the 4 styles that we identify, it's kind of a categorization system to look at some basic structure of the meditation experience. And so a focus style is exactly what it sounds like. Everybody in this audience is going to be familiar with that, where you're holding your attention on usually a single target. The mind wanders, you catch it, you bring it back. Basically anything that does that there's going to be some common elements of what's happening in the brain. And the most obvious things is that you're actually activating your frontal lobes because it requires sustained attention. You're holding your attention. So there's actually a level of activation that happens in the frontal lobes with that. At the same time, you're quieting down the back part of your brain, the default mode network, which is where all of our talking to ourselves about ourselves tends to happen. So you're focused, but you're not thinking about yourself. Mindfulness, the way we use the term, so I recognize that a lot of people use the term mindfulness as kind of an umbrella to kind of talk about everything. We're using it in a more specific manner to talk about practices where you are shifting into the observer role to notice your thoughts, your feelings, your body sensations, and in an objective, as objective as you can manner, without grasping for things you like, without pushing things away you don't like, sort of observing and letting go, what's happening in the present moment. And so again, like the terms like effortless awareness, a lot of the times I think that's what they're referring to, that sort of a practice, right? And this is a tricky one in the brain. This is the one that when we've looked at this, it's been the messiest because there's a variety of different research studies that, and sometimes what they come up with is contradictory. What we've kind of nailed down are a couple of things that we think are pretty consistent, especially if it's a body-based mindfulness where you're sort of, progressive muscle relaxation or a body scan or something. So you're activating the salience network, and specifically the right side of the insula, which is a deeper structure. And a lot of that really is body awareness. That's a lot of what the insula does, is it's like paying attention to bodily sensations, noticing what's happening in the moment. Sounds like what we're describing. But at the same time, you still need to shut down the default mode network because you don't want to turn it into a narrative. You don't want to turn it into, a story about what's happening. So, there's, at a minimum, there's those two elements. Open heart, we use as a generic term to incorporate loving kindness, compassion, but also things like gratitude, forgiveness, some other practices that, essentially all of these practices involve activating a positive emotional state and then usually doing something with it. So sending that out to others or self-compassion, giving it to yourself or, you're doing something with it typically. And there's a few patterns that show up here. One is sort of a frontal asymmetry. So activating the left frontal region. So this comes from a lot of Richie Davidson's work back in the day. And many of you will be familiar with him. He's the one doing a lot of research at, where the heck's he at? Is he in Wisconsin?
Wisconsin, I think. Yeah.
Wisconsin, yeah. Okay, yeah, University of Wisconsin.
Yep.
With the Tibetan monks.
Right. He's got the famous picture with Mingyur Rinpoche and the head, the EEG over his head. Yeah.
Yeah, he's done a lot of amazing work in this field. And anyway, one of his areas is this frontal asymmetry thing and understanding its connection to mood states. So activating the left frontal area, but then also activating some other areas of the brain, specifically that same spot as mindfulness, interestingly enough, that right insula. And the reason that this one is important, the insula does more than one thing. But the insula is also involved in emotional states and as well as things like empathy. If you're noticing somebody else's pain, that activates that right insula. So, we'll see patterns like that, like the right insula, left prefrontal. Okay. There's some other things, but keep it simple.
So would that also be like a devotional practice, a deity yoga practice would probably also activate those centers?
So this is interesting, right? And this is where this gets fun for me, is going like, it's like, well, it depends. Like what, if you're doing a devotional deity practice, are you intending to, feel love toward your deity? Is that what you're doing? Or is it, more of a focus practice, right? Where you're focusing on the image of of the deity, and you're just trying to hold just gazing at this image of the deity and just, trying to kind of hold your entire concentration there. Those are probably going to look a little different.
Could you have like a mixed effect where you've got the gamma kind of focused attention, but you also, got this other activation in the left and the front kind of?
Yeah. So this is another part that, we like to talk about these four styles as if they exist independently, right? Like they're all their own little thing. And sometimes they are. Sometimes we'll just do a pure focus practice or a pure mindfulness practice. But the reality is that most of the time it's a mishmash of these four styles. It's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And, we're here and then we shift over here. And so, and this is something that makes this a little bit tricky, I think, from a brainwave understanding, is that if it's not a pure style, you're kind of shifting around. It's not one thing that's going to be happening in the brain. You're going to be kind of bouncing around between different activation patterns. And so, and that's not bad. It just makes it a little bit harder to measure and get a clean picture of what's actually happening. And I think you had mentioned, one of the studies we did a few years ago was literally looking at that. We were looking at some experienced meditators and some novice meditators in the Arhatic yoga tradition. And they use a meditation called Meditation on Twin Hearts. And it's a guided audio. And when you listen to it, it clearly goes through 7 different little sections in the one meditation. There's an invocation, to all the holy saints, holy angels, holy masters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's that. Then there's this prayer of St. Francis of Assisi. They're like bringing this Catholic prayer. It's like, okay, all right, that's interesting. Then they do this Twin Hearts meditation, which is like a chakra thing. It's like a crown and heart chakra activation thing, and sending love to the planet. And then you're oming. And then there's silence. And then there's this like clearing thing, And so we actually broke their brainwave patterns down into each little section to see, well, what's the difference? And the brainwaves change, right? It's like not a big shock. Like the brainwaves, each little section, the brainwaves are doing something different. And so, anyway, these are one of the things that I think is fun, but also sort of frustrating in this field, is that sometimes trying to understand what's happening in the brain in some of these practices is not very straightforward.
Or it just makes it very interesting.
Yeah.
The last style then.
Yeah, the last one. Yeah. So quiet mind. Again, we chose that term because it's, again, pretty obvious what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. That state that most people imagine is that what meditation is supposed to be about, that somehow there's nothing happening. It's just sort of blank space, sort of no mind, it's just, you're just kind of like nothing's happening. And, certainly there's a lot of practices that can help you get to that space. And, the things that show up very consistently there are an increase of slow brain waves, so alpha 1 in particular, and again, particularly in the default mode network. So the default mode network shows up throughout most of these as being kind of a key factor. And so when you have a lot of alpha 1 in the default mode network, it kind of means that area's at rest, right? It's kind of being inhibited. There's nothing going on there. So you're not talking to yourself. You're not thinking about yourself. You're not, Now there's some other areas that are interesting too with that. Some language centers on the left hemisphere getting quiet. That's another thing that often happens there, because, we tend to think in words. And so if you're not thinking, then the language centers should be pretty quiet. So, there's these different patterns that show up, and it's interesting because there's some commonalities between some of them, but then there's some differences. And so, our goal is to kind of help people figure out, well, which one's going to make the most sense for you based on what your brain's up to or what your goals are, and then try to come up with some different strategies to help them learn how to get there. And that's where some of the tech comes in.
Yeah. And before we leave the different types, the fourth type, and then I actually would love to hear about the secret fifth type. Is the is the fourth type a I mean, is that where you would put non-dual states, or is the non-dual states in the secret fifth?
Uh, uh, I wouldn't put it in the fourth one.
Okay.
And so this is where things start to get really messy really quick, is when you start thinking. So the fifth style we call deep states, just because there's no better name for it. And at the moment, it's really a mishmash of a bunch of different stuff that doesn't fit into those other categories. So, the people who are interested in sort of non-ordinary states of consciousness or altered states, most of that stuff fits down in the deep states land. And there are some amazing similarities between different practices when you start getting in there. In fact, commonalities between certain breathwork practices, between psychedelics, between certain meditative states. It's like when you look at the brain, it looks pretty darn similar. Healing states, even stuff that I've looked at with psychics and mediums and stuff like that. There's these certain brainwave patterns that look pretty darn consistent, but yet they're very different states. Like you wouldn't say that they're exactly the same, but yet the brain kind of looks the same. So I feel like we don't have this one all the way figured out yet. That's why it's the mysterious, secret, special fifth one, because it's a little messy. So my guess is that the non-dual stuff is going to fit more in that category.
Okay.
We think of quiet mind as really, you're still here, you're still present, you're still in your body, you still know you exist, but there's just nothing going on, or very little, right? Like, I mean, there still might be whispers of a little thought or a little image goes flitting through, but it's pretty still. There's just not much happening.
You've quieted the selfing aspect of the mind.
Right. But then when you kind of move beyond that, right, to some sort of experience of unity, or you're connecting to your higher self, or you're doing something else like that, it's like, okay, now we've moved into deep states land.
Right.
And, and what's interesting is that those two things can kind of like mix and match with each other pretty easily. And so it's another one of those where it's like, it's a little tricky, right? Because somebody might start off in quiet mind, and the next thing you know, they're gone, right? They're off having some sort of journey. And right. It's like all of a sudden, which is great.
Right. I mean, definitely I would say like quiet mind is my access into emptiness, for example, or that unity consciousness, or, others here who practice, sort of anapanasati, into a jhana state, similarly kind of into that altered deep state, right?
Yep. So you can also, and again, for me, this is all like super fun, right? It just makes it trickier from a tech perspective, and we can talk about that in a second.
Yep.
But so like the quiet mind is really characterized by alpha 1, that 8 to 10 hertz. And there's a mountain of research, transcendental meditation, Zen, there's a bunch of other practices. In fact, I just saw an article on the jhanas that somebody did in Rick Hanson's bulletin. They published this little thing, and it was mostly alpha 1, right? And it was like, okay, so there's this pattern, but there's also interesting little flavors that can come in, right? Like, so you can get kind of an increase of frontal theta, which then it's got a little bit of a different flavor, and that tends to be associated with more bliss, that feeling of bliss, right? So that's gonna sort of tweak that experience a little bit more, right? So there's still a bunch of alpha 1, but all of a sudden you've got this frontal theta.
Yep.
And so, again, these can kind of float into each other, in certain ways.
Yeah. And in all of those states, I know, where would you say gamma plays a role in that? I guess I would be curious. And as well as I'd be curious about temporal theta, and where you see that. Because I've noticed, like in my deeper meditations, I just use the Muse, which has a lot of noise, but I've been doing it for a long, long time. So I've been kind of able to see that, oh, yeah, my theta, temporal theta in particular goes up, over time. And I see that pattern over and over again, that when I get in a deeper state of meditation, like that whole back section of the brain's just really quieted down.
Yep. So let's talk about those things. There's so many things I want to say. Okay. Let's talk about gamma.
And we'll get to devices, people, I promise.
So let's talk about gamma. So I'm a big fan of gamma. And so, gamma, so for those of you that aren't super familiar, gamma, it depends on who you're reading. People are putting it all over the place. Traditionally, it was like 40 hertz or right around 40 hertz. Now, it depends on who you look at. Some people are like, 25 to whatever, or, I tend to think of it as more like 35 to 50 is kind of the range I tend to think about. Or you'll see people that'll do like 35 to 80, this giant. I tend to think that probably we're getting into sort of a gamma 2 kind of a cluster. I think of that faster stuff as a little bit of a different beast, although it does seem to behave similarly. Anyway, these are pretty much the fastest brain waves that we measure at this point. We know the brain goes faster than that. We just don't have tech that measures it, which is a little bit of a frustrating bummer. I would love to have tech that I could measure 200 hertz and see, well, what the heck's going on up there? Of course, probably everybody knows the faster you get, the smaller they get in terms of amplitude. So you start getting fast, and it's so teeny tiny that it gets really hard to measure and to see any changes because it's so small in terms of amplitude. It gets harder and harder to see changes. Anyway, that was a sidebar. So gamma, we know that gamma shows up in expert meditators, even at baseline, they have more gamma than your average person, even without meditating. They've got all this extra gamma. And, and then of course, when they're meditating, there's a whole bunch of gamma, which is Richie Davidson's stuff with those Tibetan monks. They had 3 times as much gamma as the control group. And every time I think about that, it's like, okay, think about that for a second, right? It's not just like a statistically significant more amount of gamma. It's like triple the amount of gamma. It's like a huge. Yeah. And we know that gamma is associated with very interesting states of consciousness. We know it's associated with experts doing their expert thing. And I think this is where it tends to get that association with being in the zone or being in a flow state, where you don't really have to effort to do something at a high level or understand something at a high level, which is where I think it comes into meditation in some ways. That can you engage in whatever the practice is at a super high level, but you're not even trying. And that's that sweet spot that we all want, right? Where it's like, there's no effort involved. You just do it. It's the Yoda thing, right? It's like,
it's the Jedi state.
The Jedi state, and so, but there's other things associated with gamma, and this is where it might get into the non-ordinary states, because in non-ordinary states, you'll often see gamma as well. And so it's interesting because you see gamma in lucid dreaming. You see gamma in, psychedelics. Everything else drops out except gamma. And it's like, that's interesting. Yeah. You see it in the dying brain of rats. Yeah. What? Where'd that come from? Where did he go?
I did not expect you to say that.
That was not, Jeff just took a left turn somewhere. So they did this study where they, put electrodes in these rats' brains. And, of course it's rats, so they just do terrible, horrible things to them, but basically killed them and wanted to see what happens at the moment of death. And they had these massive gamma bursts. And And so it's like, now we obviously don't have that data in humans, but it's interesting. And again, psychics and mediums, healers, like when people are doing these really interesting things with their consciousness, we very often will see these big bursts of gamma. And so I think it's a really, I don't think we understand anything about gamma at all, hardly. I think we're just scratching the surface of what's going on there.
Yeah.
But for me, it's very exciting because clearly it's associated with some kind of interesting states of consciousness. And I like that it's the fastest stuff, right? Because it's like, we talk about getting to a higher frequency, and it's like, well, yeah, like literally that you're kind of getting to a higher frequency.
And what about the other end, the ultra slow waves? Isn't there, I feel like I heard something about like the fast waves riding on the slow waves. Maybe that was an interview with Dawson Church. I'm not sure.
Yeah. So, brain waves, and this is another thing, it's like, and things can get complicated real quick because we also talk about brain waves like they're independent things, right? Like it's like, oh, gamma, like it's just gamma. And it's like, no, we always have all of the brain waves everywhere all the time. And so, it's just an issue of kind of how much and what's their relationship and how do they work with each other. And so there is this way that brain waves behave where they're sort of coupled together. So theta and gamma, have a special relationship. Actually, so do delta and gamma. So there's these, kind of couplings that happen. And they also seem to be associated with kind of special states, right? And so, and you can kind of think of it like this way, right? So theta and gamma, it's like, well, okay, theta, so that's a really slow brain wave. And we tend to think of it as almost kind of like allowing access into deeper states of consciousness or the subconscious, maybe. It's an openness, right? So it's like, so you've got an openness, and at the same time, you've got this really high frequency that's kind of buzzing out of like a high level integration. And it's like, that could be, that could be a cool state. So, kind of layering those. And actually, I know people who have started kind of playing with that with some stim tech where, they'll layer pulse electromagnetic frequencies. They'll literally put two boxes on top of each other, one that's pulsing theta and one that's pulsing gamma.
Yeah, I've been playing around with my NeoRhythm device and with the theta and the gamma settings, but I can only do one at a time. And there's some question about how, that device in particular and, how powerful it is and can it really affect those brain waves, which, I think is a different topic, but suffice it to say, right? It makes you wonder and want to experiment and try these different things for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And, maybe I'm ahead of myself here. I don't know, but,
Go for it.
Okay. All right. So, thinking of stim tech like that, with whether it's, transcranial direct current or whether it's, AVE or whether it's, whatever. I mean, there's a bunch of good stuff out there. And, to me, it feels like there's kind of two different ways to use it. Well, there's more than that, right? But thinking of meditation from a meditative perspective. So you can use those things and almost in a passive way, right? Like hope that it kind of knocks your brain into a meditative state.
Or ultra consciousness meditative state.
And sometimes it can, right? I mean, it's like you're just kind of sitting there and next thing you know, it's like, whoa. And it just kind of like, shifts you somewhere. For me, I feel like there's more power in layering that tech with meditation where you are actively meditating. And so this understanding of what we're talking about the different brain waves and the different parts of the brain and the different styles of meditation can be really useful because then it's like, well, for example, like, audiovisual entrainment, you could pulse 9 hertz into the glasses. So right in the middle of that alpha 1 band, And even, you know, I know some of the listeners use David devices, and I'm a big fan of Mind Alive. I've used their stuff forever. And, you know, on some of their devices, you can put a little randomization thing on there where if I put 9 hertz, it'll actually fluctuate between 8 and 10 hertz. It fluctuates 1 hertz off of either side, which is easier for your brain to entrain with. It likes that better. So, so if I'm trying to do a quiet mind meditation, which is targeting alpha 1, I can run that thing at 9 hertz, put it on the randomization. So now I'm pulsing light at the exact same frequency that I'm trying to increase through my meditation practice. So I'm kind of like using 2 things together, you know, toward that specific state. And I feel like that's different than just putting on the glasses at 9 hertz and running them, you know, and just kind of hanging out and daydreaming, thinking about whatever I'm thinking about. That the effect is different. You know, and so that's something that I think a lot about with the different tech. And I'm not saying it's bad to do it the other way. I'm just thinking that the way I think about it is that you're going to get more from it if you're actively meditating with it and you're using it as a support tool. It's a, you know, we use the term scaffolding, right? So it's like, what kind of support can we provide for your meditative state, whatever that looks like, to kind of support you while you're trying to figure out how to get there. And so, you know, I see it as scaffolding.
Yeah, I love that way of thinking about it. And I, as somebody who's been kind of you know, experimenting with these toys, that has been my experience as well. That's the most interesting playground in my own exploration, is to use these devices as meditative enhancement tools, if you will, or scaffolds is even, I think, a better way to think about it. And then the thing that to me, it's like, okay, but what is the right thing to do? Like, is it to do alpha or theta, because that's, you know, gamma is going to carrier wave on that. And so no, don't pump gamma into your brain because you can't really get there from here. But, you know, train it to one of these other carrier waves that then you know, will hopefully kind of have some of these, you know, altered states that, you know, many people are kind of interested in accessing. to put it that way.
Yeah, to put it that way. Yeah. Yeah. And,
How to best.
You know, and there's, you know, and there's different ways that you can use that tech as well, right? To sort of like, you know, one of the things I like about, so I don't know if, you know, I know people use the David devices, and people may or may not be familiar. One of the newer things they've got are these glasses that you just plug directly into your computer, and it just runs off of your computer. So you don't have an extra box and all that stuff. And then you've just got a little software controller on your computer that you can, you know, modify and whatever. I don't know if this is available to the public yet, but he's got a session editor for that laptop device, or the laptop software, where you can write your own protocols for the AVE devices. So you say, oh, for the first 3 minutes, I want the left visual field to be 9 hertz, and I want the right one to be at this, and I want this to be green and this one blue, and then I want this one to shift to 12 hertz or whatever, right? So you can kind of write a program and design it yourself. And that's pretty cool, right? Because then people like yourself, or people who are like, oh, well, hey, I want to, you know, or how can I lead my brain into specific states, right? Because, you know, if you've got a busy brain and you just run it at 9 hertz, it may or may not do much. You know, you might have to start a little faster and kind of walk yourself down. You know, anyway,
And
I think
that is actually a really good question, is like, you know, what is the best way to start using these tools for people who are sort of getting into meditation? Or if I'm coaching, and I coach people who have kind of busy, anxious minds, and they're, you know, looking to get started. You know, I guess I'd be a little curious for you to touch on some of the basic, you know, best tools to use in your opinion.
You mean tech tools?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's It depends. There's because there's so many tools out there right now. It's almost overwhelming.
Okay.
I got to a point, I don't know, a year ago or so, where I stopped paying attention to any new gadget that came out, because it was like my brain was overloaded. It was like, okay, I can't keep track anymore of all the stuff, that's out there. Now I've started paying attention again. But there's a lot of cool things. And so for me, an important element, if I'm kind of working with somebody, is that assessment piece at the beginning is actually pretty important. And some of what I'm trying to understand are the things we talked about at the beginning, like, well, why are you meditating? And what have you tried before? And what worked about that? And what didn't work? And what did you like? And do you prefer to meditate by yourself or with a group? And what happens if you do movement have you ever done yoga? Have you ever done Qigong? So I'm going to ask a bunch of questions to understand. And what I'm trying to do for myself is start to paint a picture of how they operate. What's going to be my easiest way in with them? Because if they're coming to see me, obviously they've tried to meditate and they didn't feel very successful. So it's like, so I want to think about, well, what's going to work best for this person, given their lifestyle, given their amount of time, given what their experience has been in the past, what their goals are, what they're trying to do. And, a lot of times, again, this may or may not be relevant for a lot of the listeners, right? Because most people here are probably pretty experienced and, working it. But a lot of people, and I'm sure you can relate to this, Holly, that come to see us, they're basically meditating zero, right? And so, it's like, well, we're starting at zero. And so anything is going to be progress. And so I'm usually looking for low-hanging fruit. Like, what's the easiest thing that I can give them to get them started where they'll feel some shift that feels like a success. And so it's going to depend a little bit on the person, on if they seem like a better candidate for something active or something more passive. And again, I say passive, I still want them to try to meditate, but you put the glasses on, you don't really have to do much else, right? I mean, you got to meditate sort of, but you don't have to do much else, right? Whereas if you're doing like heart rate variability or something like that, or biofeedback, where, you're getting a feedback signal back to you, that's basically, now you got to sort of like pay attention to like, what does that mean? And, why did all of a sudden my coherence go into low? Oh crap, there's tension in my body. Where'd that come from? Okay, can I let that go? And without efforting and try to get my coherence back. And so, it depends a little bit on the person. And then there's, things like cost and time, because of course some of these devices are pretty cost effective and some of them are quite pricey. And, so I'm not really answering your question because it varies so widely,
Yeah, fair enough. And it probably isn't a fair question. I agree with you. I mean, in the coaching work that I've done too, a lot of it is, and just in the community, even looking at people's different practices, that it's clear that people have different affinities for different styles of practice based on their own, that we're all different, and, we access meditative states, for some people, Soma breathwork is a miracle, and for other people, like, not so much, so there you go. You have to,
There you go.
you have to figure out. So yeah, maybe, I don't know, maybe getting back a little bit with some of the last time, just talking a little bit, diving a little bit more into non-ordinary states and contemplative practices. Cause I think I just love that's, it's such a rich area and something of interest to so many people here, kind of to pick up a little bit from where we left. So we were talking about some of the different devices and, ability to play in that playground with them. And then we got people like, Judd Brewer and Dan Brown doing some really interesting scientific work, and Jay Sanguinetti doing some really interesting work with Shinzen Young. So I'm just kind of curious what your what are you following and most interested in that kind of non-dual world? Is that a good question?
I don't know. I guess we'll see. We'll know in about 2 minutes.
Okay, great.
So I was kind of alluding earlier in the conversation to the idea that there seem to be some consistent patterns in a lot of these states. And even though the states may feel different, there's some consistent patterns. And what's interesting to me is that, they're consistent with what happens with psychedelics. And it's like, huh. And it's like, well, that's weird, right? Because it's like, even though, you look at research with psilocybin, and you look at research with ayahuasca, and you look at research with DMT and LSD, it's like, so you've got these different classes of psychedelics, but yet more or less the brain looks the same. And it's like, And then you talk to all the people who have used psychedelics, and every experience is totally different. Sometimes it's really emotional. Sometimes it's really cognitive. Sometimes you meet the goddess and you're blissed out, right? And it's like, but every time is totally different. But it's like, but the brain kind of looks the same. And it's like, what's going on here, right? And so that's really made me kind of think a little bit, because this pattern shows up in other things as well, not just with psychedelics. In fact, you mentioned Soma breathwork, and I did a little study with Soma, and we found the same pattern, with Soma breathwork, and so the pattern is basically a strong decrease of all the slow brain waves. So drop of delta, drop of theta, drop of alpha in particular. And actually alpha is the one that drops the most. So this is eyes closed when we expect alpha to be the strongest, and it basically falls through the floor. And especially in the default mode network, which is again, where we expect it to be the strongest. And it's like, all right, okay. So all of the brain waves, delta, theta, alpha, and beta actually all decrease. And then you might see high beta go up, but then gamma almost always goes up. And it's like, okay, and so it took me a bit of thinking about this and talking with various people. Heather Hargraves, you mentioned Heather, you've worked with her, and, and thinking about it, it's like, well, what the heck's going on here? And, the best I can sort of tell, and, also reading things, Robin Carhart Harris and some of his work that he's done, which is brilliant. Thinking about the structure of the default mode network, and that it's largely involved in creating your identity. It's largely involved in this, from like a Buddhist selfing, right? The sort of active process of creating your sense of self moment to moment. That's kind of what the default mode network does, and it's a very overactive part of the brain.
Yeah.
And of course we know that when the default mode network is overactive, it usually leads to anxiety and depression. Basically, if you think about yourself too much, it's going to cause problems. And so
this is like the projector on the smoothie identity, right? It's like
totally.
Yeah.
And so, but it's interesting because it's like, well, why wouldn't it be like quiet mind, right? Like where, and so this is an interesting part about alpha, is that alpha is actually inhibitory. So when alpha increases, it's actually inhibiting activity. So it's like putting the brakes on things, which is why it's quiet. If your alpha goes way up, there's not much else going on. It just sort of like, it's like, okay, everybody be quiet. You're all good. You're all good. But then in a psychedelic state, it's the exact opposite. And so it's disinhibitory, right? It's taking the brakes off. And so I think that's why in some of these non-ordinary states, and why they can feel so different, but have a similar brain pattern, it's because you're basically taking that organizing part of your identity offline. And then, well, who knows what's going to happen, right? Like like any number of things could happen. And And I think it depends a little bit on the person and their temperament and where they happen to be that day, what kinds of practices they've had before, and then I think, to get to your point, I think you can learn to navigate that territory, just like with psychedelics, right? If you've never done psychedelics and you do it once, it's going to be pretty intense and overwhelming. If you do it a number of times, you start to learn how to sort of like work with it. And you can kind of learn how to maneuver in that territory, even though it's pretty weird and it's different. Well, it's the same. I think it's the same in all these other, if you get into some of these really deep meditative states, you can stay conscious enough and learn how to maneuver yourself in there, right? You don't have to totally disappear. You can get into these blissed states and still have a little piece that is able to sort of navigate. And so I think that's where the brilliance comes in. So the trick with using some of these technologies, I think, is it's like, can we use some tech to kind of get us into those states? Sure.
Yeah.
Or at least to facilitate it. But then it's like, you got to learn how to navigate it, right? Because otherwise it's like, well, who knows what's going to happen, right? Which is okay too. That's fine. So, I mean, probably my favorite way to work with that is you mentioned a lot of STEM tech. Actually, my favorite thing is, of course, using neurofeedback. And the reason that I like that, especially with this, is because you can monitor the default mode network directly. I mean, depending on what kind of device you've got, right? But the stuff I've got, you can, so, I can measure the default mode network, and I can basically inhibit delta, inhibit theta, inhibit alpha, inhibit beta, reward gamma, and then say, okay, can I find that? Can I find this space? And you can almost kind of coach yourself down into that and learn, like, man, how do I learn to let go enough that I can move into that space? And it's hard, because the ego does not want to let go. It wants to stay in control big time. And, and actually you'll see that. You can watch people's charts when they do this, and everything drops. It drops over about 15, 20 minutes. And then almost inevitably, there's this giant spike after 20 minutes, 25 minutes. And at first I didn't understand what that was. And it was like, oh, that's the ego. That's the ego going like, I've had enough. I
give up.
I want the controls back.
Or I want the controls back. Okay.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Oh, cool. So you actually use neurofeedback, like, and we're not talking like Myndlift neurofeedback with one electrode. We're talking like fancy full headgear neurofeedback. Although I'm curious if you think it would be doable with something like Myndlift.
You can do it with one electrode because, the hub of the default mode network is, right back here at PZ.
Mm-hmm.
And, PZ, is basically right here. And, right below that is the hub, which, the posterior cingulate and the precuneus, and they're huge. I mean, it's a huge region. So just by putting one electrode at PZ, you're mostly picking up that hub of the default mode network.
Okay.
And so you can definitely do it with one electrode.
Okay.
I've got some fancy schmancy stuff, right, where I can get even more specific, but we have people that do it with one electrode.
Oh, very cool. So you could technically do it with Myndlift, and you're saying just, reward gamma, inhibit everything else, and just basically train yourself. What does it feel like to just let go?
Yeah. But the trick is, you have to inhibit all of those bands independently. Because so you can do it like a big squash, which is kind of what Heather did in her research. So she made like a big 1 to 20 hertz giant band and said, let's just inhibit that whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And you can do that. But what happens is that the brain is tricky, and it will figure out like, well, wait a minute, I can actually increase this thing and decrease this thing and still get the reward, because 1 to 20 is so big. And so it'll cheat. Your brain will cheat. And well, not yours specifically, but
I'm sure mine would too.
the brain will cheat. And usually people like it, even that it feels good and they like it. but it's usually not quite exactly what we're describing. So you really have to hold the brain to task and like make sure you're catching everything, or else it'll cheat out.
Huh. And what is your, I mean, that my experience is that full on emptiness state is actually a pretty hard state to find. I mean, it's not easy. What are your instructions? What do you have guided meditations to get people there? How do you get people there?
Yeah, this is why we don't really talk about it, right? Because it's like how the heck do I instruct people how to get there, right? It's and so that's why I really like the neurofeedback, because the music, the audio feedback can guide you there. And so, you know, when I'm doing that, I'll tell people like, follow the music, and they're like, what am I supposed to do? And it's like, you know, I can't tell you, right? You know, it's like, but I have noticed that people who are better, yeah, I'm even cautious to say this, but people who are better at dissociating are pretty good at this. And, you know, because they can disconnect from their body. And so using imagery or sensation around letting go of the body, or the body becoming filled with sand or evaporating or dissipating into connecting with the environment, you know, things like that can be useful, right? Because it's that kind of letting go kind of thing, and you're not really in control anymore. So I've seen for some people that actually works pretty good, and that's their kind of strategy of how they kind of like slip into that.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. But it's tricky.
Yeah, for sure. That's neat that you're actually doing that with people. So you have people that come and say that that's what they're looking for. That they're, yeah.
Sort of. I mean, we have some people that's what they, usually what happens is people come in and they say, I want to learn to meditate because of XYZ. And then, you know, we'll kind of guide them toward what makes the most sense. Now, what's interesting about that protocol is it actually looks like it's probably a really good treatment modality for PTSD for a few reasons. But it actually emulates some research being done in Canada by Ruth Lanius and her lab. They've published, 6 or 7 research articles where they are inhibiting alpha in the default mode network for PTSD survivors. And it leads to a disconnect from the amygdala to other brain regions and a reduction of symptoms. It like softens all the hyperconnectivity of the amygdala, and then they feel better. And, you know, and if you think about that, that's the primary thing we're doing with this protocol.
Right. Well, and then that correlates with the research on why psychedelics can be really helpful for people, for trauma.
Right. And other, you know, non-ordinary states that seem, you know, like they also can help with that.
Right. Yeah. And it also reminds me of you mentioned in your book, the iRest technology or protocols, and the meditations that I tend to do. I have a few clients who have some trauma background, and and actually the meditations, I only discovered this after reading your book, but the meditations I use, which are quite awareness based, so they kind of hinge on that Muji, Rupert Spira kind of world of feeling the awareness underneath all things, this whole complete awareness that you are, which is very disassociating, right? Because you're removing the identity and saying, yeah, forget about the identity, focus on this bigger awareness that you are. And which sounded to me when I read the iRest protocol that was pretty similar. And the person I'm thinking in particular that I did it with, it was incredibly helpful for this person.
Yeah.
So,
I love it. Yeah. It's perfect. And that's the, you know, I think you're bringing up a good point, which is that there's so many good things out there, and they all kind of overlap. Right. And so that's where, and not all we've done, but we've sort of created these categories to go like, oh, well, that's where that fits. I see, oh, there's this practice that I learned. And it's like, oh, well, that's kind of like this. Right. And so it's just a way to kind of like, I think, organize our thinking about some of these things and make it slightly more scientific, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so too. And in that sense, it's helpful. It's helpful as a coach. And I think it will be, you know, helpful in the future to help, you know, other scientists kind of as you say, create a framework and a common vocabulary around these different practices and brainwave states.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I love that there's a fifth deep states. Now we're going to be talking about the deep state in the community. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're going to have a lot more coming out about that. I've just reserved it for the EEG neuromeditation work that we do, because of some of the things we were talking about, until I can get a little bit of a better way to teach people how to access it consistently. I've just kind of left it out for the moment until we sort of get a little bit more detailed with that. So,
okay. Well, if you want a community to try some things out on, I think the HeartMind community would be a great one to explore with. So
yeah, for sure.
Well, I can't believe it's been over an hour, and I'm really, really appreciative. I feel like I could talk to you for another 3 or 4 hours. So maybe we'll have to have you back sometime.
Yeah. You'll bring me back next year, and we can talk some more.
I would absolutely love to do that. And how can people find you and your work and your lab? Easiest way.
Yeah. Thanks for the promotion. So our website is just neuromeditationinstitute.com, and all of our stuff is there. There's, the styles inventory. There's actually a free course, free mini course that we just created. You can sign up for that on there, various classes and workshops and whatnot. So you can just check that out, and there's a lot of free resources on there as well.
Awesome. Wonderful. And I do recommend the book, and just really, really appreciate you and your contributions to this field. I think it's tremendous. So thank you so much for all that you do.
Yeah. And thank you. Thanks for, creating an awesome community. And, I look forward to working some more with you guys in the future.
Well, thank you. I love seeing you there when you post there. And it's just a really fun and very kind and caring community. And I think that's what we appreciate, is this community is a community of supportive people who are trying things out, and just encouraging each other and learning and exploring together, which just makes it a ton of fun. So
for sure.
Yeah. And thank you everybody for watching the show. And if you want to find me or get in touch with me in any way, go to heartmindalchemy.com. You can leave me a note there. Holly at HeartMind Alchemy. I do neuromeditation coaching. I do human potential coaching. Love working one-on-one with individuals. I have a Dream Yourself into Awakening workshop coming up with Stephen Altair and Kiefer O'Sullivan, a 10-week dream yoga, lucid dreaming, and illusory practice. So awake daytime states workshop that we're super excited about. So go check that out on the website. And just everybody have a great weekend. Thank you so much.